Dr. Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and this is One on One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Hi, Yael. Good morning.
Good morning, Yosefa.
It's great to be here with you. Today, in our third episode of this series, we're going to be unpacking the idea of secondary characters and their literary function. Sometimes these characters are anonymous, sometimes they are not, and we're going to unpack that factor as well. But really, any narrative you read in Tanakh, you'll come up against these characters, and sometimes they have a tremendous amount of meaning to offer us.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly some books that have more secondary characters than others. I think, for example, Sefer Shmuel, which just has a plethora of secondary characters, people who pop in and pop out and have just a really cameo role in the story. So it is interesting to ask what they add to the story, what's their purpose, what kind of meaning they insert into the story.
Yeah. So let's jump right in. We're going to really bring a few examples, and I think each of them offers something different. And what I do think is important is that while we'll focus on a number of central features that sometimes characterize these secondary characters, really each of them needs to be understood in their own context. There's no really broad-reaching rule. There are certain principles that I think are helpful and informative, but each context needs its own analysis.
Yeah, certainly. I think the other book that has really a lot of secondary characters is Sefer Bereshit, right? And maybe one of the most well-known and sort of curious figures is an unnamed figure. You mentioned that not all secondary characters are unnamed, and not all unnamed characters are secondary.
Yes. That's a good point.
And that's also an important point. But one of the most curious kind of, pop-in figures is this man in Bereshit Perek Lamed Zayin who finds Yosef wandering around when Yosef is going to look for his brothers, right? And of course, Yaakov has sent Yosef to go and, ask after his brothers, even though, of course, Yosef and his brothers are not really on speaking terms right now. And as Yosef is on his way, the pasuk tells us, Vayimtsaehu ish, a man finds him. V'hinei to'eh basadeh, right? He's sort of, wandering around in the fields. And the ish asks him, Ma tivakesh? What are you looking for? And he says, Et achai anochi mivakesh, right? Tell me, eifo hem ro'im, where are they? And the man tells him. And, what this really very short episode indicates to us is that Yosef is so fundamentally alienated from his brothers that he can't find them. He can't find them without help, right? There's that, it reminds me a little bit of the beginning of Sefer Shir HaShirim, where the Re'aya is, she's going out to find her dod, right? Her beloved. And she says, Hagidali she'ahava nafshi, echa tir'eh, echa tarbit batzoraim, right? She says, tell me where you are. Where are you pasturing? Where can I find you? And what's his response? He says to her, Im lo tedilach hayafav nashim, right? He says, if you don't know yourself, you've got to figure out not just, mine and your relationship. You have to figure out how to get here. Right?
You can't externalize this knowledge. It needs to be something that's inside of you. I mean, there he's playing hard to get. That's sort of always how I teach that passage. But going back to Yosef, there's something also there that when you're so alienated from your family, you have to ask somebody on the outside where your family is, right? It's sort of, again, this externalization of his relationship with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really shows us how deep the divide is. This anonymous ish that becomes the almost mediator, the one who can help Yosef, to find his brothers.
What I will say also about that passage is that many of us are familiar with the Midrash's desire to want to identify the character. And I think we mentioned that in the previous episode where we spoke about the law of conservation of personalities, that the Midrash loves to find identities for these characters. And sometimes, and that's very meaningful. And sometimes it's also very important to remember that the Tanakh presented that character as anonymous, I think also for a particular reason here. Can you sort of speak to the anonymity of that character here? Meaning, why couldn't he just have had a name? Because sometimes their names are not particularly significant.
Yeah, well, I think even more so, it shows how irrelevant his persona is to the story. He's just a linking, right? He's there in order to show us how far Yosefa is from his brothers and that he needs, someone to get him there. Chazal, not just, there's another principle involved here. Chazal abhor a vacuum, right? In other words, there's this idea that anyone who's anonymous needs to be identified. And so you're right. I mean, that's a very important principle in Chazal.
Yeah, and identifying them doesn't make them more of a central character. It just makes them part of an identifiable web of people that I think Chazal are often trying to bring to the fore. That everyone is connected somehow. They're not just pointlessly being mentioned in the text itself.
Yeah.
But I think here the pointlessness is part of the literary intention of that narrative, of realizing how far Yosef has really gone from his family. Okay, so let's move on to another example also.
Yeah. Okay. So, I think also one of the really kind of bizarre figures in, Sefer Shmuel. And as I mentioned, there are really quite a few, figures that sort of pop into Sefer Shmuel. But one of the more bizarre figures is the tabach, right? The cook, who appears at the very beginning of the Shaul story, right? And I'll just mention that the beginning of the Shaul story, where we see him going out to look for his donkeys, is kind of a similar situation as Yosef, yes. Right? Because he's looking for his donkeys and he can't find them, and he has this na'ar, right? This kind of, attendant who seems to have everything that Shaul doesn't have, right? So that, the attendant, Shaul says, well, let's go home. We can't find our donkeys. And the na'ar says, no, let's go see the Ish Elokim, right? So the na'ar knows about the Ish Elokim's presence, while Shaul does not. And then, of course, Shaul says, well, we have nothing to bring to him. I have no bread. I have no, no present, no gift to bring to him. And Nahar says, well, I have money, right? So, everything that Shaul seems to be lacking. In this case, I think the Nahar is very much a foil, right, for Shaul, and seems to represent, or seems to kind of highlight that which Shaul doesn't have. But what really is very similar to the Yosef story is that, when they do go looking for this Ish Elokim, they don't find him that easily, and they have to stop a group of young women coming from the well, right? That's highly significant. And ask them, where's the Ish Elokim? We can't find him, which suggests something about Shaul at the beginning of his journey, that he is fundamentally disconnected from the Ish Elokim. He can't find him on his own. So that's similar to the Yosef story.
Here it's his leadership capabilities that he has to externalize.
Yeah.
Those are not what are inherently inside of him at the moment. With Yosef, it's really the family dynamic, and here it's his leadership capabilities, that his na'ar, his anonymous, arms bearer, however we want to translate that, he himself has those capabilities that seem so easy for him, but for Shaul it's very, very difficult. So that's going to be his, Yosef has to get over the family hurdle, and Shaul will have to get over the leadership hurdle.
Yeah. And just to
she does with some success and some failures.
Right. Well, I mean, once he finds the Ish Elokim, that's going to help him to get to leadership.
Yeah,
but it's hard
it will
for him.
catapult his journey.
Just to connect this to our last class, I know I'm going sort of backwards, but Shaul says, Ki halechem azal mikelenu. And we talked last time, that there's no bread in our kli, in our vessel. And we talked last time about both the significance of bread and of kelim. And what he's really saying is I don't have authority. I don't have bread in my, in my arsenal. In any case, in the continuation of the story, of course, Shaul does meet Shmuel, and Shmuel's greeting of him is profoundly shocking to Shaul, who thinks he's looking for his donkeys, but as it turns out, he's going to receive kingship instead on that day. And, when Shmuel shows Shaul, basically, I've been waiting for you here, and, come with me and eat with me. And Shaul walks into this room that is filled with 30 kruim. Kruim are the invitees, right? So it's clear that, Shmuel has been waiting for Shaul, but lest Shaul think that it's all a coincidence, right? And that, Shmuel and his 30 men have been, sitting here about to eat, and it's sort of a lucky coincidence that Shaul happens upon them. Shmuel turns to the tabach, right, to the cook, and he says, Tana et hamana asher natati lach, right? Give him the portion that I gave to you, the one that I said, put aside, right? And the tabach, right, the cook, places it before Shaul, and he actually has a speaking role, which is also very striking. And he says to Shaul, Hinei hanishar sim lefanecha echol, ki lamoed shamor lecha lemor ha'am karati, right? So it seems to be that this is the tabach speaking, and the tabach says, this is what I've put aside. It was placed there for you. We've been waiting for you to get here.
We've been waiting for this moment.
And so the cook's role ends up being very significant, right? Because he is the one that indicates to Shaul beyond any shadow of a doubt that they've been waiting for him, and that this food, it's been kept on the side waiting for him, right? They've been keeping it hot for him. And it's a symbol also of the urgency, of the task at hand, right? That we're waiting for a leader to come. You are the one that God has directed us to give food to. And of course, this was the same Shaul. They said, well, I have no food, right? I have no bread in my arsenal. Now we're going to feed you. We're going to prepare you. We've been working on this. We've been laying the foundations of this. So, this cook who seems to be really so kind of marginal, it turns out that he really is very important for indicating to Shaul, what is about to happen, and that all of this has been premeditated and planned.
Right. It's almost as if the tabach here feels to me like it's sort of like the handing over of the baton, right? So he's sort of, I think sometimes to go back to the literary question, that sometimes the anonymity is there in order to facilitate a broader picture. And because if we get too engaged in their identity, we might lose the symbolic significance of the moment. This doesn't always work, but I think in this case, this might work in this story, that so the fact that he doesn't have an identity allows us to realize that the tabach is going to hand him something, and it's sort of the officiating ceremony. I mean, there'll be another ceremony or two in the future, but it's the actual moment. And so if we would identify him, we might lose sight, right? We might lose sight of the laden moment that is at this moment. And so sometimes I think the anonymity sort of furthers that sense in the narrative of keeping us on track and understanding the symbolism of the moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's just an agent, right? He pushes forward the plot, or he kind of, sharpens our understanding of one aspect of the story, but he himself is not a relevant character. He's
right.
Not
that goes back to our first episode where we spoke about the agent versus the developed character versus the flat character. So he's definitely an agent here. Another good example when speaking about, I think, secondary characters as foils, that they're really there to oppose the central character. I think also Orpah is a great example from the book of Ruth. Orpah really, I think, symbolizes what most women would have done in this situation. And when Naomi sort of starts off with this speech to try and convince them not to go with her, because there really is no logical reason why they shouldn't just try and start their life again in their natural homeland. Initially, Ruth and Orpah respond similarly. In Pasuk Tet, she says to them, "Iten Adonai lechem umatzeena menucha." God will hopefully continue to give you respite and to have a positive life. Vatishak lahen, vatiseena kolan vatifkena. Initially, they kiss and they all cry in seemingly a goodbye ceremony, and then they continue speaking. And she says, please, and they want to come with her. And she says, Vatoma Naomi, shovna benotai, lama telachna imi, haod li vanim b'me'ai, v'hayu lechem le'anashim. I don't have any other children to give you in order for you to have sons. And if you come with me, you're not going to be very good shidduch material, so no one's really going to want to marry you. And at this point, Orpah decides differently. Then she continues on speaking to them, but eventually Orpah decides differently than Ruth. Pasuk Yudalet, Vatisena kolan, Vatifkena od, Vatishak Orpah lechamota, Veruth tavka ba. And here we have the classic formulation of opposition, that Orpah kisses her mother-in-law in a goodbye, and Ruth clings to her. And so in that moment, we have sort of the separating of their paths. And after that, we have the moving speech of Ruth, who responds to her mother-in-law of Antif ki'ivi leozvech lashuv me'achorayich ki el asher telchi alech uve'asher talini alin amech ami ve'elohayich Elohai ve'asher tamuti amut. Right, wherever you sleep, I will sleep. Your gods are my gods, etc., etc. And in that, Orpah does not have a part because their paths have already separated.
Yeah.
Right. Of course, what I meant to say is that your God is my God, not in the plural. But really, you have here Orpah and Ruth, who are also presented in the beginning of the narrative as really being of equal standing. That they're both from the Moabite world, and they both marry into the family of Naomi. They're sort of completely on equal footing until that pivotal moment in their life when Orpah decides to do what is natural and logical, and Ruth decides to do something that utterly defies any logic and any seeming benefit for her future life. And so here, the character of Orpah is significant, really vis-a-vis how much she exemplifies. She accentuates how much Ruth is an exemplary character. We don't know much about her. The Midrash, of course, fills in certain details about her, but she just seems to be a regular Moabite woman.
And particularly kind as well. I mean, she clearly cares for her mother-in-law.
She lasted through a few levels of her speech before she actually parted ways, meaning she doesn't just, hear one word and say, all right, I'm out of here. She doesn't run away quickly. There's 2 levels of speech there before she decides to part ways with Naomi. And again, in many ways, she does something that is very, very understandable. And so really her character serves to highlight, Ruth and her exemplary character.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons that Chazal are so harsh with the character of Orpah, because as you said, I think when we read it without keeping in mind the midrashim that we learned, what we see is really a very reasonable and kind and compassionate young woman. And yet, in order to really highlight and emphasize, that distinction between them, Chazal tend to be a little bit harsh with Orpah, because really compared to Ruth, Ruth sort of rises above this pair and individuates in this really unusually kind to the point.
It reminds me also, and we blenched this also in I think the first episode, but it really reminds me of the opposition drawn between Noach and Avraham by Chazal. Meaning the Psukim don't compare them, but Chazal compare them, right? That if he would have been in Avram's generation, then he wouldn't have been all that special. But I think that judgment of Noach there is similarly, or that harsh judgment, I think is similarly a little bit unjustified. Also in that case, again, we have questions about Noach and his behavior in that story, but I think here, Orpah seems even more innocent and positive, even than Noach was. Meaning with Noach, we have questions. Why didn't he protest? Why didn't he daven? Things that become sort of commonplace for the prophet vis-a-vis the people and God. But Orpah, I think, is presented as even more wonderful than Noach is in that way.
I'll just say one thing about Noach and Avram, and that is that, like many midrashim, I think it is based on a textual comparison that's going on, right? Because Noach is described as Tamim haya b'doratav, et ha'elokim hitalech Noach, as opposed to Avram, where God says to Avram, hitalech lefanai v'heyet tamim. So there's the active and the passive, which I think is pretty much what Chazal are saying. Noach was obedient to a fault, but not active. And Avram was active and therefore surpasses Noach.
Yeah, I understand.
One of the things that I think is important to note always about Midrash is that the Midrash, sometimes it's detached from the Psukim, but more often than not, its ideas can be found in the text itself.
Yeah, I think that it's there. I just think that the comparison between them reminds me of the comparison between Ruth and Orpah, and I feel that for both of them, we're Chazal are very critical of the contrasting character.
Yeah.
In a way that just needs to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt, based on what also is written in the Psukim. Okay, so that's one example, I think, of Ruth and Orpah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are a lot of characters in Sefer Shmuel who function as a foil. We've already seen the Na'ar, the attendant of Shaul, who certainly is a foil for Shaul, or seems to be, highlighting what Shaul does not yet have. So we see the Na'ar has it, and we kind of even more so think, well, why doesn't Shaul have money? Why doesn't Shaul have the idea of going to see the Ish Elokim? And, we see that a lot with David, I think. So, I'll mention maybe two examples. One example is Doeg HaAdomi.
Yeah.
He really only appears in one story in Sefer Shmuel, in chapters 21 and 22, the chapters of Achimelech, right? The Kohen of Nov, who obviously...
They're both redheads. Stam, I'm making a joke, but yeah.
David and
Doeg.
Absolutely, right? Well, I'm going to talk about that in a moment.
Meaning I'm making a joke. Meaning one from Edom and one who is Admoni, but yeah.
Right, but there's something that absolutely connects David and Doeg there, and I think that is maybe, part of it. Adomi, we don't exactly know what it means. Probably it does mean that he comes from Edom, but of course, Edom does have...
There's a play on words there also.
Yeah, there's definitely a play on words there. David is an Admoni, right? So there is definitely something that connects them there. But more than that, look, I want to say one other thing about Doeg HaAdomi, and that is that even though he only appears in one story, and it's the story where he ends up being the long arm of Shaul to violently massacre the Kohanim of Nov because they helped David and because Shaul has sort of sunk into this terrible place of, suspicion that, and even paranoia that everyone's helping David and plotting against him to take the kingship away from him until, we arrive at this really terrible scenario of the massacre of, the Kohanim of Nov, the priest, the whole city is massacred by Doeg. But that, Chazal do something interesting with the, minor character of Doeg. And that is that they use him to fill in the blanks of many of the anonymous characters in Sefer Shmuel, which is something that Chazal do. It's also worth noting that, right? That's what we talked about.
The conservation of personality.
Exactly, right? The conservation of biblical personalities, but that sometimes there's a certain figure that Chazal sort of latch onto, and it becomes
they become like the fill-in in all different cases.
Yeah, so Doeg is a ubiquitous figure in Chazal, even though he really only appears once in Sefer Shmuel. Another example of that, by the way, is Datan and Aviram.
Yeah, I was going to say in all the Midbar stories.
Yeah, all the Midbar stories.
They're like always the bad guys.
They only appear once in all of Tanakh, right? Only in the Korach story. Yeah. But they become any pair that is undermining Moshe, right? And so Doeg becomes David's nemesis. And, anything that seems to be someone who is trying to cast suspicion upon David in the eyes of Shaul, he is identified as Doeg, right? So for example, at the very beginning of the story, when Shaul, or at the beginning of David's story, really, when Shaul is searching for a character, for someone to alleviate his ruach ra'ah, his
anxiety.
Bad spirit. And so, they send out looking for a person, who is appropriate, and we have this Na'ar, and he says, Hine ra'iti ben li Yishai beit halachmi. I saw this son of Yishai, and he's everything. He's Yodeh Nagen v'gibor chayil v'ish milchama unvon davar v'ish toar v'Hashem imo, right? And all these descriptions that he gives of David, he knows how to play, an instrument, and he's a man of strength and a man of war and a man of understanding and a beautiful man, and God is with him. Chazal identify him as Doeg HaAdomi, and even say that Doeg is trying to plant the seeds of suspicion in Shaul's mind, which is interesting because that is, of course, Doeg's role later on certainly is not just the antithesis of David, but really the nemesis of David. But I want to suggest something beyond that, and that is that he is the foil of David. Right? Of course, you mentioned before that the Adomi and the Admoni maybe kind of, have a wordplay between them. But how is actually Doeg described? He is the Abir Haroim Asher L'Shaul. He is that strong, shepherd of Shaul's men. And that's David, right? Yeah. David is the Abir Haroim Asher L'Shaul. And, you have this kind of figure of Doeg HaAdomi. I will mention as an aside, which I said to you before, that the name Doeg and the name David actually in Gematria are the same name. It's not my usual form of exegesis, but it's kind of a neat point. But I think that the main point is that, I think Doeg represents for David the road not taken. Who is Doeg? Doeg is the one who stays by Shaul's side as Shaul kind of spirals away from Darchei Hashem, from what God wants him. Because, of course, after Shaul is told by Shmuel, God's rejected you, you're no longer the king, instead of stepping down, as perhaps he should have at that moment, he remains kind of, almost tenaciously clinging to his position. And it's not to his benefit, and it's not to Am Yisrael's benefit, because he becomes more and more, he strays farther and farther from the path. And I think kind of the climax of the troubling stories about Shaul is, of course, the story of Kohanei Nov, when he turns to Doeg and he enlists Doeg as the one who's going to kill these 85 innocent priests. And how does he kill them? Me'ish ve'ad isha, me'olel ve'ad yonek, v'shor v'chamor, v'aseh lefi charev, right? All these categories of people, men, women, children,
it's what Shaul didn't do to Amalek.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's the opposite of Amalek. Yeah. And so Doeg is the one who sticks with Shaul, even as Shaul kind of spirals in the wrong direction. And David pulls himself away from Shaul, forges his own path. Of course, this is partially because he's going to be the victim of Shaul's suspicions. But Doeg perhaps represents for David what would have happened to David had David stayed with Shaul and stayed on the path of Shaul. And so I think Doeg actually is a foil for David, and therefore becomes kind of disproportionately important in Chazal as well.
Another secondary character I think that's worth mentioning is Vashti in the story of Esther. Now, of course, she's a named character, and she also, like Doeg, only comes up in one place, and she doesn't come up again after that. But I think her role in the beginning of Megillat Esther is also utterly informative. I wouldn't necessarily say that she's a foil for Esther. I actually think that she's sets a precedent for Esther after. Again, I know I'm going against possibly a little bit of the midrashic perspective on Vashti, which, by the way, there are a lot of varied midrashim about Vashti. We tend to highlight some of the very negative ones, but in the beginning of Megillat Esther, we see her in Pasuk Tet. וגם ושתי המלכה עשתה משתי נשים בית המלכות אשר למלך אחשוורוש. And here we have represented as she's paralleled at the moment, until this point seems fairly in line with her husband, that she makes a women's party while her husband has the men's party. And only 7 days later, right? כתוב לב המלך ביין, אמר למהומן ביסתה חרבונה וכולי וכולי. He says to all of his servants, משתלטים את פני המלך אחשוורוש, להביא את ושתי המלכה לפני המלך בכתר מלכות, להראות העמים והשרים את יופייה, כי טובת מראה היא. And he wants her to come adorned with her crown, to show off her beauty to everybody. And in the beginning of this first meeting with Vashti, we're introduced also to the really heinous approach to women that exists in Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther is very unique in its presentation of the Persian approach to women, and I believe that it's meant to be understood as something utterly negative, meaning we are supposed to feel very critical and disgusted by the way women are treated in the Megillah. They're mentioned in many places. They're gathered like sheep in many places, and their beauty is emphasized over everything else, which of course makes it even more moving when Esther becomes a leader and takes that, she got there because of her beauty, but she takes it to a very, very different place. But Vashti is the first one who stands up to this, male society that mistreats women in this way. ותמאן המלכה ושתי לבוא בדבר המלך. מה פתאום, right? I'm not going to come. I'm not going to just be your trophy wife. I'm not interested in that. And she is sort of the first female character that we get a sense that while women are mistreated, the salvation will come through the women who are able to fight against this horrible, debasing culture. And so she is, she's the impetus for Achashverosh's anger. She's the impetus for the need to look for a new wife. And so in that way, she creates the opening in which Esther can come and fulfill that role. But really, Vashti is there as the first precedent of what women are capable of doing if they can fight against the abusive culture that they, in this case, are found in a very big way in the book of Esther.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just add that it goes so beyond, anything acceptable, the mistreatment of women, to the degree that women are objectified as bodies, right? Even as dead bodies. I'll just mention as an example that in the description of the preparation of each woman before she's allowed to come into the king. So we're told she has to soak in, one kind of oil for 6 months and another kind of oil for another 6 months. And the pasuk tells us, Ki ken yimleu yemei merukehem, because that's how much time it takes to, properly embalm themselves. And that exact same expression only appears in one other place in Tanakh, and that is in the description of the mummification of Yaakov.
Yeah,
right?
the end of Sefer
At the end of Sefer Bereshit. So the objectification of women in the story of Esther is constantly being sort of indicated in all sorts of subtle ways, to the degree that at some point, any woman in the story is who has a sense of self is going to refuse the king's request, which might seem innocent, but is really deeply, deeply disturbing.
Yeah, and I think that Vashti is, she's a bit of a hero in the beginning of the story, and Esther will take it much, much further, meaning she'll take her refusal to the place of, national salvation. But certainly on the level of the individual, Vashti is there to let us know that, women have the capability to fight against this kind of culture.
And the dangers that it entails.
Yes,
by the time Esther comes around, she is well aware that what she's about to do is going to endanger her life.
Yes.
So that's also another important role that Vashti has for teaching us Esther's courage, and despite the fact that you don't want to go the way of the first wife.
I will just say, by the way, that I think that on a broader level, that very often when women try and do something new in the world or ambitious, there is often, and I would say even just when any humans try and do something new, there is a risk that the early generations take when they make change. I think it's beyond the woman question, and that sometimes it costs them their life, whether that means their reputation or that means their future career development. And it's a gift to be able to be a continuing generation, that you have those moments still. I wouldn't even call them mistakes. They're just natural consequences of what happens when you're trying to do something utterly countercultural. And Vashti is that she's the revolutionary in that sense of the female role. And Esther is coming in with that awareness that almost paralyzes her, right? It almost paralyzes her. But coming in with that awareness, and ultimately can take that initial revolution and take it a few steps further because of Vashti's initial heroism. So
Vashti's not a foil. She's I
think she's a precedent. I think she's she's an early example that Esther consciously learns from.
If we move on and talk specifically about unnamed figures in Tanakh.
Yeah.
Our unnamed figures, we assume, I think, at first glance, that they're going to be secondary characters because they don't have a name. But that's not always true. And it's interesting. Look, it was very obvious, I think, that the example that I started out this program with, the Ish that finds Yosef wandering in the field, that he's a secondary character because he has a cameo role. He pops in and then he disappears. He doesn't get a name. He has all of the characteristics of secondary characters. But sometimes we have secondary characters, or sometimes we have characters that may appear to be secondary and are not, or characters that may appear to be main characters but are in fact secondary.
Okay.
So, I mean, let's say an example of who I think is a secondary character who is unnamed is Eved Avraham, right? And that's despite the fact that Eved Avraham, who is chosen by Avraham in Perek Kaf Daled, right, in chapter 24, to go and bring back a wife for Yitzchak, and he becomes, of course, a major character in the story. I mean, he may even be the main character in the story, but he's never named. And he's only ever called, and of course, because Rashi names him and calls him Eliezer, many people just sort of refer to him offhandedly as Eliezer, but it is really important to note in the story that he's only ever called either Ha'ish or Eved Avraham. And what's interesting about the story is that he emphasizes how marginal Yitzchak is to his betrothal story, right? He does sort of seem to be a foil for Yitzchak. He's unnamed, but he's not even Eved Yitzchak. He's Eved Avraham.
Yeah.
So that Avraham becomes pretty much featured in this story of Yitzchak's betrothal. And the Eved who, does all of the things that we expect
Yitzchak to do.
Yeah. And any man in his betrothal scene to do, he does all this as a proxy, but not a proxy for Yitzchak, a proxy for Avraham. So there's something that is going on here, which is, kind of interesting because it really emphasizes both Yitzchak's passivity and Avraham's very outsized role in Yitzchak's betrothal story. So I would say that the Eved Avraham is a secondary character, even though he seems at first to be a main character.
Interesting. Right. Meaning definitely in terms of the amount of psukim that are devoted to him, he gets a tremendous amount. It's an interesting definition because I think that in the actual narrative itself, I don't know if I would call him a secondary character, but we're supposed to understand that he is secondary to others, and that's why he doesn't get a name. Meaning he's the protagonist of that story, Yael. He's the only one acting. There's even a great theory out there, I don't remember who said it, who think that Rivka thought she was actually marrying him, right? And that's why when she sees Yitzchak, she falls off, because she thinks that she's actually there to marry the Eved and not to marry Yitzchak. Interesting theory. It's something to ponder. But he's a protagonist of that story. But his generational role or his national role, I think, is meant to be secondary. I have to think about the definition. I totally agree with you that his anonymity is very significant here. And I agree with all of that analysis. But I feel like on a literary level, I look at him as a protagonist of that story, even though he's certainly meant to be understood completely and utterly as subservient to Avraham. And
we could argue that point, but I think the more important point is to note those features.
Yeah, of course. It's just a semantic argument. Yeah, totally.
But then there's another example, let's say, of an unnamed character that is very clearly, in my mind, the protagonist of the story. And I mean, I think there are several examples, but the example that I'll take for now is Eshet Manoach. Now, Rav Breuer, who is a pretty sharp person, he used to call Manoach Ba'ala Shel Eshet Manoach. Right?
Yeah, the husband of Mrs. Manoach.
The husband of Mrs. Manoach. So she obviously receives a name based on her husband, right? She's called Mrs. Manoach, wife of. But what Rav Breuer was pointing out is that, he is very much a secondary figure in the story. And she's very much the main character in the story. For those of you who don't remember the story, I'll just review the story, which is in Perek Yud Gimel in Sefer Shoftim in chapter 13. And they're the parents of Shimshon. They get a whole perek, a whole chapter about them. And she's one of the classic barren women stories. And the malach comes to her and promises her a child and tells her about the child's destiny. Right? He's going to start to save Am Yisrael from the Plishtim. And she runs home to her husband. Of course, he also tells her that, this child is going to have to be a Nazir, right? He's going to be a Nazirite from the time that he's born, and you have to be very careful. Don't drink wine, be very careful in your pregnancy to maintain his purity, his in utero Nazirite status, which is very interesting. And she runs home and she tells her husband Manoach what happened, and she tells him, but she doesn't tell him everything. She never tells her husband Shimshon's divine destiny. She never tells her husband what Shimshon is designated to do, to what end, this miraculous birth is about to happen. And ultimately, of course, Manoach is disturbed by this, right? So he says, wait, I need the malach to come back to me and tell me what we should do with this boy, because she skipped part of the information. And so Manoach prays to God, and the malach comes again to her, right? Yeah. And so there's something very ironic about the story. What I'll close by saying about this particular story is that, she has all the information, and she's clearly the wiser of the two, right? She knows right away that he's an angel, and Manoach gets hint after hint after hint that he is meeting an angel, and he never quite absorbs the message until the angel disappears, in a flame of fire. Then, az yada Manoach ki malach Hashem hu, right? Only then does Manoach know. She knows right away. So she's clearly very intuitive. She's clearly very, she's clearly very smart. But she doesn't seem to particularly want her son to have a divine destiny. And she kind of evades it. She does. And she never tells Shimshon. She's the only one that has the information as to, what he is supposed to become. And she never tells him. She could have. When Shimshon comes to his parents and says, well, I met this great Plishti woman, I'm going to go marry her. Her husband speaks and he says, really? You want to go marry a Plishti woman? You can't find a nice Jewish girl, right? That's what he says. And she's silent. And even though she has the information.
And she's noted as being present. That's the important meaning. She's noted. It's not just that he has an interaction with his father, but she's noted as being present in that moment, meaning she doesn't disappear from the story.
Yeah. So, I would conclude by saying that Manoach is righteous, but not very intuitive. Which is something that Chazal do say about him, that he was, they say, Manoach am haaretz haya, right? Manoach was
everyone recognizes that he was a bit slow on the uptake.
Yeah. And Eshet Manoach, I think, was deeply intuitive, but not particularly righteous, at least in the sense that she is not interested in having a miracle child born with a divine destiny.
It also connects to the fact that she's one of the women who doesn't seem to be in distress about not having children, right? We mentioned that, I believe, in the first episode. She doesn't daven for a child. We don't have that part of the barren woman scene. Yeah. So she may not even be particularly looking for this mission.
Well, especially because the mission
will turn out to be quite complicated, her child
and
also.
Always is. Every miracle child born to a barren woman in Tanakh has a divine destiny, which is one that is dangerous. And that, I think, represents life to some degree, right? Every child is born into a divine destiny, and one has to struggle to fulfill their divine destiny. She doesn't want it.
Right. But here you would say that her anonymity is almost like a punishment for not being righteous?
I would say that her anonymity, that her name is taken away from her because she doesn't fulfill her divine destiny.
What?
Yeah. That's what I would say about her. But, there are different opinions about her, and that's not the...
I think the other approach that I've also heard, I don't want to misquote him, but I believe Professor Uriel Simon also writes in an article, is that he talks about the fact that the narrative comes to highlight, as we said, sort of like the obtuse nature of Manoach himself, right? That he just doesn't get the hints, and he keeps wanting, he's chasing after the Hitgalut, after this revelation, and then when it finally does come, he doesn't actually get it, so the narrative sort of it focuses on Manoach, even though clearly the character who pulls us forward is the wife. So meaning by keeping her just named according to him, it sort of serves to emphasize even more so, serves to emphasize even more so how much he doesn't really get what's going on. But that's interesting. I'll have to think about that. Wow. I think to close with one more example for today is another example from the book of Shoftim. There are a number of other anonymous women. I think they all have different roles. But I think it's important to note that Yiftach's daughter, and also the concubine from Giv'ah, from the story of Pilegesh B'Giv'ah, which in a minute I want to broaden the discussion of the anonymity in that story, but those women are anonymous, and I believe there it highlights their victimhood. And that sort of also just to round out sort of this list of what we've mentioned of why a character can be left anonymous. Sometimes they're anonymous because they're a secondary character. Sometimes they're anonymous because, and they can also not be anonymous, but they could be a foil, perhaps, these secondary characters, whether anonymous or not. And sometimes it could use the word victim or a loss of identity. And I believe that Bat Yiftach and certainly the Pilegesh are women whose identity sort of is taken from them. And that I think is a significant piece as well. But to broaden that, there's another function of anonymity, and that relates to all the other anonymous characters in the story of Pilegesh B'Giv'ah. In that last really significant unit of stories from chapter 17 to 21 in Sefer Shoftim, where you have just in the story of Giv'ah, everybody is anonymous. And you have the Levite who's anonymous, and you have obviously the concubine and her father, and the men from Binyamin, and every character mentioned in the narrative is anonymous. And there are a lot of discussion, certainly in the academic literature, as what the anonymity is clearly intentional. And that's another question, just from a literary perspective, that we often have to ask is, how much is the anonymity intentional? How much is it not? Now, when you're talking about an entire narrative, clearly the anonymity is going to be intentional. If it's a very secondary, minor character in a story, so the anonymity sometimes is there is just to keep the narrative flowing so we don't get distracted by another character. And then when those really minor characters are named, we have to ask ourselves, why are they named? Which comes up in Sefer Shmuel all the time. And also we have a few examples in Megillat Esther. But here, where every character in the narrative is anonymous, we have to ask ourselves, why? Why is everyone anonymous? Even the clear protagonists of the story. And this is probably one of the most gruesome, horrific stories in all of Tanakh, certainly in the book of Shoftim. Again, just in broad brushstrokes, we have here a Levite whose concubine, he's not her full wife, she's not his full wife, who leaves him. She goes back to her father's house. He goes to retrieve her. He ends up staying for a long time, seemingly just schmoozing with her father and not really doing any rectification with his wife. Eventually, he takes her. He stops because he fears that he is not going to make it in time, and he doesn't want to get stuck in a non-Israelite city. He stops in the area of Binyamin, thinking that people will take him. We have a lot of questions about this Levite, about why he makes his decisions. He could have made them in a smarter way. And he ends up going to Binyamin. They have a fear of strangers. It is very similar to the city of Sdom. They actually want to violate him. And in a last ditch effort to save himself, he sends his concubine out. I'm skipping a few stages of the story, but that's really the thrust of it.
It's a Sdom-like story.
It's a Sdom-like story. The real story there is a fear of the other. It's not necessarily, and it becomes a story about rape of women, even though that wasn't not that the initial intent was positive, but that wasn't the initial intent of the mob that was waiting outside the door. But in that story, I think one of the really compelling explanations for why everybody is anonymous is that it's presenting the everyman of the period of the Shoftim, meaning where the nation has sunk at this point. It presents us with the fact that this Levite, they're supposed to be these cultic figures who are, more holy than others. Nope, they're not like that. All of them, they could be the anonymous Levite that actually was in the story before this one in chapter 17 and 18, who they just become Levites for idolatrous temples. And they could be this Levite who doesn't seem to have any clear cultic role, but he also has a house that is utterly falling apart and a wife who he doesn't take care of. And we have here this woman who, again, I think is anonymous for her victimhood, symbolizing the fact that she is just an object in the eyes of all these people, which again is presenting the negative societal state at this point. There are a lot of times the negative treatment of women is a reflection of the moral state of the people at that time. It's not meant to be taken as a given, or that's how women were treated. I don't think Tanakh ever really presents women in that way at all. But here we really have that this is how everybody could have behaved at this point in history. And so the anonymity serves there to sort of blur the identity of them, because it could have been in Binyamin, it could have been in Ephraim, it could have been in Zvulun, it could have happened anywhere at this time in history.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's correct. I also would emphasize that when you have a society of unnamed people, you're talking about a society where people are alienated one from the other, where people don't see each other as having agency, as having dignity, as having subjectness. So, I mean, unfortunately, we have a terrible example in our century of what happens when you take away people's names and you replace them with numbers. And that's when you look at someone opposite you and you say, they
dehumanize them.
Right. They don't have the right to a name, to food, to safety, to dignity. And that's really what these chapters are about. It's about a society that has unraveled in terms of their interactions with each other. I will add that I think that is one of the goals of Megillat Rut. Megillat Rut's stated goal is lahakim shem hamet al
the emphasis on names there is very, very prevalent.
Yeah, which I would, sort of paraphrase as saying, the goal of Megillat Rut is to restore names. And, just to add to what I was saying before about Eshet Manoach, I think that there are several examples in Tanakh where someone fails to fulfill their divine destiny and therefore doesn't get a name. And a very good example is Ploni Almoni, who in Megillat Rut was supposed to restore the name of Naomi's family and instead is called no name. And, so, I mean, it's so symbolic that he doesn't get a name. And Chazal kind of pile on to the symbolism by suggesting that his name was Tov. Right? He was supposed to be named Good, but because he wasn't good, so he loses his name. But I would look at it in a more, in a broader sense, that when someone deliberately doesn't get a name, it suggests that they have failed to live up to their individuality, to their personness. And that's more than just, I mean, I brought Mrs. Manoach as, an example of this, and, you can agree or disagree with that particular example, but it does appear in other stories as well that someone can lose their name because they haven't lived up to it.
That's really interesting. I think just to close the episode for today, and the next episode will be looking specifically at women, we've sort of mentioned a number of different features, and I think that just by our discussion, you see how important individual assessment of each narrative is, meaning there are some sort of broad guidelines, but every narrative has to be understood in its own context within that book, how much that book places emphasis on character, how much the particular narrative is emphasizing the protagonist and the secondary characters, how much it interplays with anonymity. So really the individual context is really significant. But we did mention some just as a summary. We mentioned that sometimes secondary characters are meant to be foils. Sometimes they're meant to be there to highlight another aspect of the narrative. Sometimes the anonymity is there to obliterate the identity of the character, and sometimes the anonymity is there as dafka to highlight the character, but to highlight a certain aspect of the character. So each situation needs its own analysis. But this has been fun. Thanks, Yael.
Thank you, Yosefa.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Thank you to the entire Matan team for their input. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, and Matan's website, and write us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.